So what I want to do is I want to focus on just this one snippet from one of her videos. And I think that this snippet is a good segue into the issue of the Kafkatrap fallacy as it manifests in this particular kind of ideology. And also talk a little bit about stacking the deck and closed systems. And I'll explain shortly what I mean by those terms.
There were a couple of times in grad school where I started questioning it. I had mentioned a few of those instances. There was another time, I can't remember what the shooting was because unfortunately in this country there are many. But there was basically, like, for lack of a better term, a healing circle for people to discuss a police shooting. And I went. I felt like I needed to go because I was afraid that there wouldn't be very many white people there. And if there aren't very many white people there, what does that say? And so I wanted to be a good white person. Okay. And also I knew some of these people who were troubled by this. And it is troubling when you see interactions that go wrong and people die. And I remember having been taught that you should listen to people of color. Just be quiet and listen. And I'm like, okay, I'll just be quiet and listen. And during that circle, one of the doctoral students in my program made a comment about, like, I see white people in here and they're really quiet and I don't know why that is. And I thought, this is being put in a position where you cannot make a good choice here. Right. And a white woman started to speak and then she started to cry, and I was so anxious because I thought, oh no, it's white women's tears. Yeah. You're not supposed to do that. Right. This is wrong. Yeah. And I just remembered feeling really unsettled. And so there were these chips that happened.
Okay, so I thought that was an interesting case because I'd heard of instances like that before myself, but it was just interesting to see it confirmed that this actually was happening in a particular university program. But I thought it was a perfect demonstration of how the Kafkatrap fallacy can work in practice. Now, another video that Leslie did on her channel, she shared her screen where you could see an element from the online platform that she used in her university, in Antioch University, and there were certain resources. And in one of these sections, you can see here on the screen, there's what's called the covert white supremacy pyramid on the right-hand side. There's this kind of column. And the idea, I guess, here is that these are behaviors or things that people say which are examples of white supremacy in action. On the left, then, there's this list of books of recommended reading related to white supremacy and anti-racism. Importantly, as you can see here, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is listed. And I think white fragility as a concept, but also the book as well, is a perfect illustration of the Kafkatrap fallacy in action. But there were certain features here on the right which jumped out at me. This, I think, is a really good synopsis of the ways in which this particular kind of subculture of social justice activism and social justice theory uses Kafkatraps in order to insulate it from any possible criticism. So I just want you to take notice, first of all, of the following two alleged features of white supremacy, which are actually, I think, contradictory, but which reveal the way in which this kind of perspective insulates itself from any possible criticism. So you can see here, one alleged feature of covert white supremacy is white silence, which basically means the silence of white people in the face of ongoing injustices perpetrated against minority communities, whether that be black people or Asian people or whoever it may be. So when a white person doesn't say anything or doesn't go out in the street protesting or join in activism against that kind of injustice, that allegedly is an instance or an example of white supremacy. But you'll notice just pretty shortly following on from that, they have another feature of alleged white supremacy, which is the white savior complex. And the idea here basically is that it's problematic when white people assume the ability or the capacity to engage in political action or activism on behalf of marginalized communities in the face of perceived injustices. So you see the tension here. It seems as if no matter what a white person does, essentially it can be interpreted as an instance of white supremacy and therefore racism, Because if I try to speak up and speak out against perceived injustices against marginalized communities, that can be simply conceived or interpreted as white savior complex. Whereas if I don't do that, then that can be perceived and interpreted as white silence. So in either case, I'm committing an act which is allegedly an instance of white supremacy and racism. So that just gives you an example of how it's virtually impossible to avoid being accused of white supremacy if you're a white person under this perspective, under this ideology. But further down, I wanted to focus on another very important alleged feature of white supremacy, which is this one here, denial of white privilege. This, for me, is a perfect encapsulation of the Kafkatrap rhetorical strategy that is so often deployed by this particular subculture of social justice and woke ideology. The idea basically is that any person who is white who rejects or denies or tries to speak against the accusation that they are beneficiaries of white privilege or that they are indeed suffering from white supremacy or racism, anyone who objects, their objection is taken as proof that they are indeed guilty of the accusation. This is a perfect way to insulate the ideology and the perspective from criticism, since any criticism coming from the outside, that is to say from a white person, any objection raised by a white person can immediately be construed as just more proof of their white supremacy, of their white privilege, of their problematic racism. Even if that racism is being denied by the white person, it can just be construed as them being in denial. They're simply fragile about their repressed inner racism. They can't confront it, they can't recognize it, and therefore their objection is just a manifestation of that psychological denial, of that repression. This kind of approach, this Kafka trap, is endemic in social justice circles and woke ideology, and what essentially it does is it makes the ideology unfalsifiable. And the reason is because even if, for example, a minority speaks out against this ideology, say if a black person speaks out against it or questions it or says not all white people suffer from white privilege or white supremacy or anti-black racism or whatever it is, that in turn is usually perceived as internalized racism. So this is the perfect Kafka trap. It essentially makes this an unfalsifiable doctrine. Another term for this is a closed system. So when a theory or when a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses are unfalsifiable, we sometimes refer to that as a closed system. It cannot be penetrated by criticism. It cannot be shown to be false. Now, the important thing to note here is that in the case of social justice theory and woke ideology, it's not that it is unfalsifiable in the sense that it cannot specify conditions under which it could be proven false. So, for example, it could easily be said that, a society in which there's zero racism and zero prejudice and which everyone is perfectly equal, that would be an instance in which it would no longer be true. This social justice perspective would no longer obtain. It would have been rendered obsolete by perfect justice being realized in the world. So it's not unfalsifiable in that sense. The way in which it's unfalsifiable is it's methodologically unfalsifiable. So in other words, it means that anyone who attempts or even begins to attempt to criticize or bring countervailing evidence, they can just immediately be preempted through this methodological move, the Kafka trap. So it formally insulates the ideology from being falsified. So the reason I wanted to show you this case and to highlight the prevalence of the Kafka trap rhetorical move, the Kafka trap fallacy, is because I think that a lot of people get trapped by this. And there's a reason it's called a Kafka trap. It's because it is a trap. It's a way of ensnaring you into a position where you feel like you have no option but to concede. You're going to be accused if you stay silent. You're going to be accused if you object. And there's no other option left to you, it seems. If you're aware of this ploy and you have a name for it, you can actually more effectively resist this. If you draw attention to the fact that you see what the person is doing and you can call them out for doing it, if you can say, when they, for example, say that your denial is just simply more proof of your white fragility, it's more proof of your white privilege, your white supremacy, when they make that kind of rhetorical move, the Kafka trap, you can simply point it out. You actually have the tools, as you're familiar with critical thinking, to say, what you've just done is what's called a Kafka trap fallacy. Here's the reason why it's fallacious. Now can we actually talk about the content of my objection rather than the fact that I've objected? It's not necessarily always going to work, but I think that it would actually throw a lot of these people off who deploy this kind of rhetorical move, because they think they can get away with it because people don't really know generally how to respond to it. They don't even know what's happening most of the time. They're not aware of the fact that this pattern is being deployed, this trap is being deployed. Whereas if you actually call them out on it and you make them aware of the fact that you know exactly what they're doing and you have a name for it and you can concisely explain it and express it to them, that's probably going to put them down on the back foot, and often they won't really know how to respond because they won't have come across this before. They won't have actually heard someone call them out in this way before. And that opens the door a little bit then to the possibility of actually having a more honest discussion about the actual content of your objection, explaining why, for example, you might feel that you are not inherently racist, or that you are not necessarily privileged because of your whiteness, or that you're not necessarily a white supremacist, and so on and so forth. And if you can get into the content of your objection rather than allowing them to distract with the fact of your objection itself, you stand a better chance of resisting this kind of ploy. You stand a better chance of opening up genuine dialogue and getting to the content of the arguments rather than the fact of your objection itself being somehow proof of your guilt. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking the subscribe button below this video and also the little notification bell to ensure that you are notified anytime some new content is uploaded to the channel. Also, hitting that like button will really help me reach more people. It will help my videos appear in more search results, so that would be great. If you like what I'm doing as well, you can support me by becoming a Patreon if you go to the Patreon page, which again is linked in the description below. And if you become the middle tier member, you will gain access immediately to the Critical Thinking Toolkit, which is the online course which goes through all of the most common fallacies, cognitive biases, and basically just teaches you how to become a better thinker in all walks of life and how to avoid error and argue more effectively. You can also, if you prefer not to become a subscriber and not to pay a monthly fee, you can donate a discrete amount of money by going to my page on the website buymeacoffee.com. Again, the link is in the description below. That's a nice way of just saying thank you to creators that you like if you want to just make one discrete one-off donation. So again, I would really appreciate your support there as well. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.